Hello. Tonight, 5 night shift stories from gas stations so far from town that the darkness seems to begin at the edge of the parking lot. If you enjoy quiet stories like these, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from tonight. For years, I kept a receipt in the back of my wallet that printed before anything had happened. The paper has gone soft now, and most of the ink is gone. You can still read the time if you hold it near a lamp. 2:17 in the morning. What you cannot read anymore is the name beneath it. That was the part that made me stop working nights. In the fall of 2008, I was 28 and living in a rented room outside a place called Dry Wells, Nevada. Dry Wells was not much of a town. There was a post office that closed at noon, a church with a white metal roof, 6 or 7 streets, and a diner that stopped serving dinner at 8. I worked 16 miles east of there, at a gas station called Red Mesa Fuel. The name was grander than the place. It sat by itself beside a 2-lane highway, with 4 pumps, a gravel lot, a low concrete building, and a sun-faded sign that hummed whenever the wind came from the north. Behind the station there was nothing but scrub, dark hills, and an old service road that disappeared toward a dry lake bed. My marriage had ended the year before. There had been no dramatic betrayal. No one had thrown plates. We had simply spent too many months becoming careful around each other, and by the end, careful was all we knew how to be. My daughter, Emma, was 5 then. She lived with her mother in Reno. I told myself the night shift was temporary. I told myself I was saving money, getting my head straight, building something steadier. Mostly, I was hiding in a place where nobody expected much from me. Red Mesa was perfect for that. From 11 at night until 6 in the morning, I could go an hour without seeing another person. Truckers passed through sometimes. So did miners, long-haul couriers, and people who had underestimated the distance between towns. One instruction from training stuck with me. If the register froze, do not unplug it. That warning came from my manager, a woman named Carla Venn. She was in her 50s, wore reading glasses on a cord, and had worked at Red Mesa long enough that she could tell which pump had stopped by the sound of the bell over the door. The register hates being rebooted, she told me on my first night. If it locks up, call me before you touch anything. I asked what could possibly go wrong. She looked at me over her glasses. It loses the time. I thought she meant the internal clock. For the first 6 weeks, nothing strange happened. The station was boring in ways I came to appreciate. I read paperback crime novels behind the counter. I learned which fluorescent tube flickered when the compressor kicked on. I learned that coyotes sometimes crossed the lot without making a sound. At 2 in the morning, the road could look completely abandoned in both directions. That was when the receipt printer started. The first time, I was refilling the hot water tank by the coffee machine. I heard the short mechanical chatter from behind me. I turned around and saw a receipt curling out of the register. There was no customer. No one at the pumps. The screen still showed the clock and the fuel totals, exactly as it should. I tore off the paper. Pump 3, 3 gallons of regular, $11.40, cash. Time of sale, 2:17 in the morning. I looked up at the wall clock. It was 2:12. I remember that because I checked it twice. The receipt had printed 5 minutes ahead. I assumed the register clock had drifted. Old equipment does strange things, especially in places where repairs happen only when something stops working completely. I put the receipt under the till and went back to the coffee machine. At 2:16, headlights appeared on the highway. A pickup turned into the lot and stopped at pump 3. The driver was a thin man in a denim jacket. He came inside, put 3 crumpled dollar bills and a 10 on the counter and said, 3 gallons on 3. I looked at him. Exactly 3? He shrugged. That'll get me where I'm going. I rang it up. The total was $11.40. The receipt printed normally. The time was 2:17. For a few seconds, I did not move. The man took his change and left. I pulled the earlier receipt from beneath the till and placed the two side by side. They were identical. Same pump, same gallons, same total, same payment type, same minute. There was one difference. At the bottom of every Red Mesa receipt, beneath the total, the register printed a 6-digit transaction number. The new receipt had one. The earlier receipt did not. There was just an empty line. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time I was sitting on a milk crate near the back door, eating crackers and watching a moth throw itself against the security light. The printer started at 2:17. The receipt said Pump 1, 7.8 gallons, $29.64, credit card. The time at the top was 2:24. I stood behind the counter and watched the road. Nothing came from the west. At 2:22, a car appeared from the east. It was a dark green station wagon with a roof box. The driver used Pump 1. He paid by card. 7.8 gallons, $29.64. The transaction completed at 2:24. Again, the first receipt had no transaction number. I called Carla. She answered on the 5th ring. "Does it matter?" she asked after I explained. "I think it matters." "Is the money right?" "Yes." "Are the pump totals right?" "Yes." "Then tape the receipt to the nightly sheet, and I'll look at it in the morning." I asked if this had happened before. There was a pause. Not a long one. Just long enough for me to hear her move the phone. "Old register," she said. "Don't make it into something." The line went dead. The next morning, the receipt was gone from the nightly sheet. Carla said she had thrown it away. After that, I began writing the times in a spiral notebook. I did not tell anyone. For almost 2 weeks, nothing printed early. Then one came at 1:58. A bottle of water, a packet of sunflower seeds, a disposable flashlight, cash. Time of sale, 2:41. That bothered me more than the others because it was 43 minutes early. I waited. At 2:35, a silver hatchback pulled in. A woman about my age came inside and walked directly to the cooler. She bought water, then sunflower seeds. At the register, she looked at the rack of cheap flashlights near the batteries. She picked one up, put it down, then picked it up again. "Do these work?" she asked. "Usually." She smiled. "That's reassuring." She added it to the purchase. The total matched the receipt. So did the time. 2:41. I stopped thinking of it as a malfunction. I still tried to explain it, but my explanations became more complicated. Maybe the register was receiving delayed information from the pumps. Maybe the timestamps were wrong. Maybe I had seen the numbers and somehow guided the customers toward those purchases without realizing it. I began to dislike the sound of the printer. It was not loud. That was the problem. It was the same ordinary little motor I heard all night. Except now it sometimes seemed to begin before the reason for it existed. Near the end of October, the receipts changed. The first one, printed at 2:17. Coffee, black, $1.29. No pump. Time of sale, 2:19. 2 minutes later, a man entered. He wore a tan work coat and a baseball cap with no logo. He was maybe 60. He poured coffee into the largest cup. I watched him walk toward the counter. He stopped halfway. Then he looked at the small cup dispenser. He poured the coffee from the large cup into a small one. "Don't need that much," he said to himself. The small coffee cost $1.29. Black. No add-ons. Time of sale, 2:19. Before he left, he looked past me toward the back hallway. "You still keep the phone back there?" I glanced over my shoulder. There was no phone in the hallway. "Bathroom's back there." He shook his head. "The pay phone." "We don't have one." He stared at me for a second. Then he gave a small nod. "Right." He left. The next morning, I asked Carla if the station had ever had a payphone. She was counting scratch tickets and did not look up. "Outside, years ago." "Where?" "East Wall." I went around the building. There was a pale rectangle on the concrete near the ice machine, about shoulder height, and 4 plugged holes beneath it. I had seen the marks before. I had thought an old vending machine had been mounted there. "When did they remove it?" Carla shrugged. "Before you started?" The answer felt intentionally small. That afternoon, instead of driving home, I went into Dry Wells and stopped at the diner. Carla's sister worked there. I knew that because everyone in Dry Wells seemed to be related to someone who had worked at Red Mesa. Her name was Denise. I asked if she remembered the payphone. She did. "Thing never worked right after they moved the highway line," she said. "What highway line?" "The old road used to run closer to the lake. State straightened it in the 90s. I asked why the phone mattered. She looked at me. I didn't say it did. I told her about the man in the tan coat. For the first time, she stopped moving. "What kind of hat?" I said there was nothing on it. She asked if he bought coffee. Small black coffee. Denise lowered the pot. "You tell Carla?" "Yes." "What did she say?" "Nothing useful." "That sounds like Carla." I waited. Denise wiped a clean spot on the counter. Then she said, "There used to be a night clerk named Howard Lusk. Worked there before Carla took over. He kept notes about people coming through late. Said they asked about the old road." "Why?" "No idea." "Where is Howard now?" She looked toward the kitchen. "Dead 10 years." That was not the answer I wanted. Before I left, Denise said something else. "If the register starts printing things you haven't sold yet, don't read too far down." That night, Carla called before my shift. She asked whether I had talked to Denise. I said I had. Carla was quiet. Then she told me there was a gray filing cabinet beneath the desk in the office. "Bottom drawer," she said. "There's a binder with tank records from the old system. Bring it out." I found the binder under 3 years of tax forms. There were photocopied receipts taped to notebook paper. No transaction numbers. Dates from 1998 through 2001. Each had been annotated in blue ink. 7 minutes early. Customer arrived from east. Same items. Do not mention road. The handwriting was small and square. Howard Lusk. It had printed at 2:17 in the morning on November 3rd, 1999. At the top was the usual Red Mesa header. Below it, where the purchased item should have been, there were 4 words. Call from East Wall phone. At the bottom, Howard had written only 1 sentence. Phone was removed in April. I sat in the office for a long time. When Carla arrived just after 6, I was still there. She closed the door behind her. "You read the binder?" Yes.
I should have thrown it out.
Why didn't you? She looked at the filing cabinet.
Because every few years somebody thinks they're losing their mind.
I asked her what the receipts were. She said she did not know. I asked about the old road. She sat down. The road, she told me, had once run east of the station before turning south around the dry lake. It had been abandoned after the state built the straighter section. Most of the old pavement had broken apart. Parts were now on private land. People sometimes still found the entrance because outdated maps showed it. But that was not the part Howard cared about. In 1999, a winter storm stranded several drivers near the lake bed. One of them reached Red Mesa before dawn. He told Howard he had followed taillights for miles on the old road. The car in front of him had eventually turned toward a set of lights. He had followed. Instead of finding a town, he found the gas station. Carla said Howard never believed the story. Not completely. What does that have to do with the receipts?
I don't know.
You do know something.
She rubbed her forehead.
Howard said the register printed the man's purchase before he came in. Then it printed another one after he left.
What did the second one say?
Carla looked toward the front window.
Nothing he sold.
I waited. She finally said,
it had Howard's name on it.
My name was not programmed into the register. None of ours were. The receipts only showed the store number. What happened to him?
Nothing.
Nothing?
He quit 3 months later, moved to Elko, lived another year.
That answer unsettled me more than if she had told me he vanished.
Then why did he quit?
Carla stood up.
Because he started waiting for things to happen.
Before she left, she gave me one instruction.
If one prints with your name, don't make decisions because of it.
I started calling Emma more often before work. At first I told myself it was because the station was quiet and I had time. The truth was less flattering. I had spent a year telling myself I needed to fix my life before I could be a good father. I was beginning to understand that she was 5. She was not waiting for a finished version of me. One Tuesday, she asked if I could come to her kindergarten program in December. I said I would try. There was a pause. Then she said,
"You always try."
She did not say it angrily. That made it worse. I promised I would be there. The night of November 18th was cold enough that frost formed around the metal bases of the pumps. Traffic died early. At 1:45, a cattle truck came through. At 2:10, a state maintenance pickup passed without stopping. At 2:16, I was standing behind the counter with a cup of coffee. The printer started. I did not move. The receipt slid out slowly and stopped. I could see the time from where I stood. 2:17. I waited almost a minute before tearing it off. There was no pump number, no item, no price. Just my name. Owen Mercer. Underneath it was a second line. East Wall. I felt the room become very still. The cooler compressor shut off. The fluorescent hum above me seemed louder. I checked the front windows. Empty lot. Empty highway. I remembered Carla's instruction. Do not make decisions because of it. I folded the receipt and put it in my wallet. Then the bell over the door rang. The door had not opened. I watched it for several seconds. Nothing moved. I walked around the counter. The bell rang again. This time, I noticed the sound was not coming from the door. It was coming from outside. From the east wall. I stayed inside. A minute passed. Then another. At 2:21, the sound came again. Not a bell. A telephone. Old-fashioned. Metallic. 2 short rings. Then silence. I could see the pale rectangle on the concrete wall through the side window. There was nothing mounted there. The phone rang again. I called Carla. No answer. I called Denise at home. No answer. I told myself that someone had left a cell phone outside. I told myself sound carried strangely in cold desert air. I told myself a dozen things. Then headlights appeared far to the east. They were not on the highway. They were south of it, moving slowly across the dark. The old road. I had never seen a vehicle out there at night. The lights moved behind low brush, vanished, then appeared again. They were heading toward the station. The phone rang once more. I went outside. I wish I could tell you I did it because I was brave. I did it because I had spent most of my adult life avoiding things until they became someone else's problem. A marriage, a daughter, promises, bills, conversations. Standing behind that counter, I knew exactly what I would do if I followed my usual instinct. I would wait. So I opened the door. The cold hit my face immediately. I walked to the east wall. There was no phone. The ringing had stopped, but on the ground below the pale rectangle was a receiver. Black plastic. Coiled cord cut cleanly 6 inches from the end. I picked it up. It was warm. There was no dial tone. I held it to my ear anyway. For several seconds I heard only a faint, open-line hiss. Then a little girl said, "Dad?" I almost dropped it. The voice sounded like Emma. Not exactly. More like Emma speaking from the far end of a bad connection. "Dad? Are you coming?" I could not answer. The headlights on the old road were closer now. 2 white points moving through the brush. The voice said, "You said you would." I closed my eyes. It was not a memory. Anna had said those words before. Not in that exact order, but close enough that my mind could have built the rest. That was what I told myself. Then the receiver clicked. A second voice came on. My own. Older. Tired. It said, "I kept waiting until there was nothing left to be late for." The line went quiet. I put the receiver down. When I looked back toward the old road, the headlights had stopped. They were maybe half a mile away. I could not see a vehicle, only the lights. Then they turned off. The dark came back all at once. I stayed outside for another minute. Nothing moved. When I went inside, the printer was running. A second receipt waited beneath the blade. I nearly left it there. Instead, I tore it off. At the top was the time, 2:29. Below it was a single item. One way, total, $0. At the bottom was a date, December 12th. December 12th was the day of Emma's school program. I sat behind the counter until sunrise. The receiver was still outside when Carla arrived. She saw it before she came in. She stood beside it without touching it. Then she looked at me through the window. I handed her both receipts. She read the first, then the second. Her expression changed. "Howard got one like this," she said. "With a date?" She nodded. "What was his date?" "The day he quit." I asked if anything happened. Carla looked down at the paper. "He drove to Elko that morning and never came back to Red Mesa." "That's it?" "That's it." "What about the date?" "That was the date." I looked at her. "So the receipt told him to leave?" "No.
She pushed it back across the counter. It printed paper. Howard made the decision. I drove to Reno that afternoon. I told her I wanted to change the custody schedule. Not someday, now. There was a long silence. Then she said, "All right." I kept working at Red Mesa for 3 more weeks. I did not quit because of the receipt. At least, that is what I told myself. I gave notice. I found a warehouse job in Reno. It paid less. My room cost more. For a while, I slept on a mattress on the floor. On December 12th, I sat in a folding chair in a school cafeteria while 23 kindergarten children sang 3 songs about winter. Emma wore a silver paper star on her head. Halfway through the second song, she found me in the audience. She smiled. That was all. No lights went out. No phone rang. Nothing happened. The next morning, I took the receipt from my wallet. The line that had said one way was still there. The date was gone. Completely blank. I called Carla. She told me the receiver had disappeared from the east wall. She also told me the register had not printed early since I left. For a long time, I thought that was the end of it. Then, in 2019, I stopped at Red Mesa while driving through Nevada for work. The building was still there, but the station had closed. The pumps were wrapped in faded plastic. The windows were boarded. The big roadside sign had lost half its letters. I walked around the east side. The pale rectangle where the payphone had been was still visible. Someone had drawn a small mark on the wall beneath it. Just 2 numbers. 217. I stood there longer than I should have. Then I heard a car on the highway. A young woman had pulled into the abandoned lot. She stepped out and walked toward me with her phone in her hand. "Sorry," she said. "Do you know if this road goes through?" She showed me her map. A thin gray line ran south from the station, across the dry lake bed, then east. The old road. I told her no. I told her to stay on the highway. She thanked me and drove away. Before I left, I checked my wallet. The receipt was still there. The time was still readable, 2:17. But the name beneath it had changed. It no longer said, "mine." It said hers. The speaker at Pump 7 had no wires connected to it when I heard my own voice come through. That is the part I still have trouble saying, without making it sound more dramatic than it was. There was no scream, no burst of static. Just a small plastic speaker mounted beneath a faded red call button, and my voice speaking from it, in the flat, tired way I used to sound when I was angry and trying not to show it. The words were from a conversation I had spent 15 years remembering differently. I was working nights at a place called Cedar Run Market in the summer of 2013. It sat at the junction of 2 county roads in southern Missouri, far enough into the Ozarks that most people who stopped there were either local or lost. The building was low and square, with a green metal roof and 6 regular pumps out front. Pump 7 stood by itself along the eastern edge beside the diesel tank. It was older than the others, with a dim display and no card reader, so customers had to come inside before using it. Behind the store, the land dropped into timber. Oak, hickory, cedar, and a narrow creek you could hear after heavy rain. In August, the air stayed warm long after midnight, and insects gathered so thick around the canopy lights that sometimes the white siding seemed to move. I was 46 then. Before Cedar Run, I had spent almost 17 years at a commercial printing plant outside Springfield. I worked the bindery floor, mostly second shift. The plant closed in pieces. First one line, then another, then half the warehouse. By the time my position disappeared, I had already stopped believing the promises taped beside the time clock. I took the gas station job because I could get it quickly. The night hours paid a little extra, and nobody there knew my family. My younger brother, Noah, and I had not spoken in almost 6 years. If anyone asked, I said we had grown apart after our father died. That answer was convenient because it was mostly true and left out the part I did not like talking about. Our father had owned a small repair shop and a few acres of rocky land outside Ava. When he got sick, he made me promise that Noah and I would handle everything together. I said we would. Then, after the funeral, I found bills I had not known about. Equipment loans, back taxes, a second mortgage on the shop. I panicked. I sold what I could. I used money from an account that Noah believed was supposed to be divided between us. I told myself I was protecting both of us from a mess he did not understand. The first time he asked me about the account, I lied. The second time, I got angry that he did not believe the lie. The last time we spoke, he told me he wanted one honest sentence from me. I told him if he had already decided what kind of person I was, there was nothing left to say. For years, I remembered him hanging up first. Cedar Run was quiet enough at night that I could go a long time without thinking about any of that. My shift started at 10 and ended at 6. I made coffee, cleaned the roller grill, checked the cooler temperatures, counted cigarettes, and kept an eye on the pumps. Around midnight, the last fishing boats usually came through. Between 1 and 4, there might be a log truck, a sheriff's deputy, or someone trying to reach the lake on a road that became gravel without warning. The owner was a man named Earl Maddox. He was 63, broad through the shoulders, and moved with the stiff patience of someone whose knees hurt all the time. His daughter handled the books. Earl handled everything else. On my first night, he showed me the pump call system behind the counter. Each pump had a button. If someone needed help, a light came on and a small speaker crackled. We could answer through a microphone mounted beneath the register. Pump 7 was different. "Button's dead," Earl said. "Don't worry about it." The little square marked 7 had a strip of tape over it. I asked why the button was still outside. "Cheaper to leave it than pull it." That was all he said. For the first month, Pump 7 caused no trouble beyond the usual things old machines cause. It printed paper slowly. The nozzle clicked off too early. The price display lost one segment whenever the temperature stayed above 95. Then one night in late July, I heard someone breathing through the counter speaker. It was a little after 2. I had just mopped the tile near the coffee station when the speaker clicked once. No light came on. I waited. There was a faint sound like wind passing over a microphone, then 3 or 4 seconds of slow breathing. "Cedar Run," I said. "Can I help you?" Nothing answered. I checked the pumps to the front window. The lot was empty. I assumed one of the call buttons had stuck earlier, and the system was releasing some leftover noise. The equipment was old. Earl repaired things with salvaged parts. There was no reason to make more of it than that. A minute later, the speaker clicked again. This time I heard a man say, "I already told you." The voice was low and distant. It sounded as if he were speaking from inside a car with the windows closed. Then a woman said something I could not make out. The line went silent. I stepped around the counter and looked through the glass again. Still no one. I checked the call panel. Pumps 1 through 6 were dark. The square for 7 was dark too, beneath its strip of tape. When Earl came in at 5:45, I told him the intercom had picked up voices. He did not seem concerned.
Radio bleed, he said.
Through the pump speaker?
Through anything if the wiring's bad enough.
He mentioned truck radios, hunting radios, utility frequencies. There were towers on the ridges. People used cheap handheld sets in the woods. It sounded reasonable. I asked if it had happened before.
Years ago.
He said it casually, but he had already turned away when he answered. The next time happened 4 nights later. A thunderstorm had passed north of us without reaching the station. I could see heat lightning beyond the trees, bright enough to outline the ridge for a second at a time. A little after 1:30, a minivan pulled up to Pump 4. A woman came inside with 2 sleepy boys and asked if the highway ahead stayed paved. I gave her directions and watched the van turn west. About 10 minutes later, the speaker clicked. A child's voice said, "Mom, I said I don't want to go back." Then the same woman who had just left said, "We're not going back, I promise." I recognized her voice immediately. I stood behind the counter with my hand resting on the register drawer. The conversation continued for maybe 8 seconds. The child asked something about his backpack. The woman told him it was in the back seat. Then the line went dead. I had not heard them say any of those things inside the store. I told myself they had used the pump button before coming in, and the system had somehow delayed the audio. That explanation lasted until I remembered they had been at Pump 4. The next morning, I walked out to Pump 7 before I left. The call button was the size of a quarter, set into a small metal panel beneath the speaker grill. Someone had painted over the panel years earlier. The red paint had faded to pink. I pressed the button. Nothing happened inside the store. I pressed it again and held it down. Still nothing. On the following shift, I asked Earl if I could test the intercom with someone outside. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary. "Why?" "I want to know which button is bleeding into the line." He sighed, but he agreed. I stood behind the counter while he walked from pump to pump. 1 through 6 worked. The sound was poor, but I could hear him clearly enough. At Pump 7, nothing came through. "Push it again," I said through the microphone. I watched him press the button. No light, no click, no sound. Earl came back inside. "Dead means dead." I told him about the woman and the child. He frowned. "Were they still on the property?" "No." "Then you heard somebody else." He said it in a way that made the conversation feel finished. For the next week, the speaker was quiet. I almost forgot about it. Then, on a Sunday night, a man named Curtis Hale came in for coffee. Curtis drove a county road grader. He was somewhere in his late 50s and stopped by 2 or 3 times a week. He had a narrow face, gray hair, and a habit of reading every notice taped near the door. That night he stayed longer than usual because one of the bridges east of us had been closed after a storm. We were talking about the detour when the speaker clicked. Curtis stopped in the middle of a sentence. A woman's voice came through. "You keep saying later, like later belongs to you." The words were clear. Curtis looked at the panel. "Who's that?" "I don't know," a man answered, too softly for us to understand. Then the woman said, "Then don't come home until you can say it." The speaker went silent. Curtis looked through the windows. There were no vehicles outside except his grader truck and my car. "Which pump called?" he asked. "None of them." He walked behind the counter before I could stop him and leaned toward the call panel. "Do that again." Nothing happened. Curtis stared at the taped square marked 7. "That one?" I asked why he thought so. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Earl ever tell you what was here before the remodel?" I shook my head. Curtis looked toward Pump 7. "There used to be a phone out there." "A payphone?" "Not exactly. More like a courtesy phone. Direct line to the store." He said drivers used it before the front canopy was expanded. The old counter had been on the opposite wall, and the phone connected through a buried cable. "When did they remove it?"
"Long time ago. 90s, maybe." I asked why the button and speaker were still there. Curtis shrugged. "Ask Earl." The next morning, I did. Earl opened the box of powdered creamer and said the outside phone had been removed in 1999 after lightning damaged part of the system. "So Pump 7 used to be the phone?" "Sort of." "Is the wire still connected?" "No." He said it too quickly. I asked how he knew. "Because I cut it." He carried the creamer box into the back room. That afternoon, I slept badly. I kept waking with the sentence from the speaker in my head. "You keep saying later, like later belongs to you." It was not something Noah had ever said to me. Still, it bothered me for reasons I could not explain. When I returned to Cedar Run that night, Earl had left an old maintenance binder on the counter. A yellow note on top said, "If you're going to worry, at least worry accurately." Inside were handwritten repair records going back to the early 90s. Most of it was ordinary. Compressor service, tank inspection, cooler repair, roof leaks. There was one page from August of 1999. Courtesy line removed after strike. Underground pair abandoned. Exterior speaker remains in place. Interior connection cut at wall. Earl had initialed it. I checked the wall behind the register. The current call panel was newer than the old record. A bundle of gray wires entered from below and disappeared behind the cabinet. The line for Pump 7 had been clipped short. Not disconnected at a switch. Cut. I could see the copper. I sat on the stool behind the counter and stared at it for a while. At 1:53, the speaker clicked. I did not answer. A man said, "You don't have to decide tonight." A woman replied, "I already did." I wrote the words on the back of a cigarette inventory sheet. The line went quiet. At 2:20, it clicked again. This time I heard laughter. 2 women, maybe. One of them coughed halfway through it. Then nothing. At 3:11, a tired male voice said, "Just leave the keys under the mat." I started writing everything down. Over the next 2 weeks, I filled 6 pages. The voices were not dramatic. That was what made them difficult to ignore. People talked about ordinary things. A missed appointment. A dog at a neighbor's house. A rent check. Whether someone had enough gas to reach Mountain Grove. Whether a sister was still angry. Sometimes I heard only one side. Sometimes 2. Once there were 3 voices, all speaking over one another about a flat tire. Nothing in the conversation sounded supernatural. But I began noticing a rule. Every voice belonged to someone who had been at Cedar Run earlier that night. Not necessarily inside the store. Sometimes I remembered a truck at the far pump, or a car that had stopped only long enough to use the trash barrel. The speaker did not replay what they had said at Cedar Run. It played something else. Something private. I could not tell whether the conversations had happened before they arrived or after they left. That question kept me awake more than the voices themselves. I tried an experiment. One night, a young couple stopped for gas. They barely spoke. The man paid inside, while the woman stayed in the passenger seat. After they left, I wrote down the time and their license plate. At 2:46, the speaker clicked.
The woman's voice said, "I'm not calling her from your phone." The man said, "Then use mine." She answered, "That's what I just said." I wrote it down exactly. The next evening, the same car came back. I asked the man if they had forgotten something. He looked embarrassed. "My wife left her wallet." The woman came in behind him. While they were checking the counter, I did something I still feel uneasy about. I read them the 3 lines I had written. The woman went completely still. Her husband looked at her.
"Where did you hear that?" she asked. I told her the truth, or as much of it as I understood. She asked what time. I told her. She looked at her husband again. "That was at the motel," she said.
"What motel?"
"In West Plains, after we left here." Her husband asked if I had some kind of scanner. I showed them the cut wire behind the panel. They did not stay long after that. The woman found her wallet beneath a rack of tourist brochures. Before leaving, she asked me not to repeat the conversation to anyone. I promised I would not. That should have been enough to make me quit listening. Instead, I became careful about it. I kept the volume low. I stopped writing names unless I was sure I had heard them correctly. If the speaker clicked while a customer was inside, I turned the microphone down and waited until they left. I told myself I was trying to understand the rule. The truth was less flattering. I wanted to know what people said when they believed nobody else could hear them. There is a kind of power in that, even when the things you learn are small. A husband telling his wife he had lied about overtime. A mother admitting she had not mailed a letter. A man promising someone he would stop at the next town, and then saying he probably would not. I never heard crimes or grand secrets. Mostly I heard the private places where ordinary people failed each other. That was harder to dismiss. One night, near the end of August, Curtis came in just after midnight. He saw the pages folded beside the register. "You're still keeping track?" I said I was. He shook his head. "Maybe don't." I asked why. He looked toward Pump 7. "My mother worked here when I was a kid." I waited. She heard it too. That was the first time anyone told me I was not the first. Curtis said the old courtesy line had always been strange, even before the lightning strike. Sometimes the clerk would pick it up and hear a conversation instead of the person standing outside. Sometimes there would be no one at the phone at all. "Did your mother know what it was?" "No." "Did Earl?" "Earl bought the place later." I asked why Curtis had never mentioned any of this before. He gave me a tired look. Because saying something happened and understanding it are different jobs. Then he paid for his coffee. At the door, he stopped. "My mother had one rule." "What?" "If it says your name, turn it off." I almost laughed. "How do I turn off a cut wire?" Curtis looked back at me. "You leave." 3 nights passed. Then the speaker said my name. It happened at 2:08 in the morning, a time I remember because I had just written it on the cooler sheet. The click came first, then a man's voice, Noah's voice. Older than I remembered it, but unmistakable. "Miriam, I'm asking you one more time." I could not move. There was a pause. Then my own voice answered. "You already got your answer." I turned the volume knob all the way down. The speaker kept talking, not loudly. The sound simply continued at the same level, as if the knob had no connection to it. Noah said, "I don't care about the money anymore."
My voice said, "Then why are we still talking about it?" That was wrong. I remembered the final call with Noah. I remembered standing in my kitchen. I remembered him accusing me. I remembered trying to explain. I remembered him saying he could not trust me. I remembered him hanging up. The speaker continued. "I want you to tell me you lied," Noah said. My voice answered, "I did what Dad would have done." "That isn't what I asked." "You want me to make myself the villain so you can feel better?"
No. I want one honest sentence. My hands were shaking by then, but I was not frightened of the speaker. I was frightened of recognizing my own tone. Cold, defensive, certain. Noah said, "Did you take the money before you told me?" My voice said, "Yes." There was a long silence. I had forgotten that word, or changed it. For years, I had told myself I never admitted anything. That Noah walked away because he would not let me explain. The speaker gave me the part I had removed from the story. Noah said, "Thank you." Then my voice said, "Now don't call me again." The line went quiet. I stood behind the counter until I heard insects striking the window again. I had no memory of saying that last sentence. None. But I knew the voice was mine. At 3 a.m, I locked the front door and called Earl. He answered on the 4th ring. "I'm leaving," I said. There was a pause. "Did it say your name?" I looked at the cut wire behind the panel. "You knew." I knew enough. "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me?" I almost said yes. I knew that was not true. Earl came in 20 minutes later. He did not ask what I had heard. He took a screwdriver from beneath the counter and removed the call panel from the wall. Behind it, the clipped wire for pump 7 hung loose, exactly where I had seen it before. Earl followed it down to the floor, then into the small utility room. The other pump wires entered a conduit that ran beneath the concrete. The wire for 7 ended 6 inches below the counter. Someone had cut it there, too. A short, dead piece of cable connected nothing to nothing. Earl held it between 2 fingers. "There," he said. "Now you know as much as I do." I asked why he had left the speaker outside. He sat on an upside-down milk crate. "Because when I bought the place, the old owner told me removing it made things worse." "What does that mean?" "He took it down once. Said people started hearing voices through the freezer fans." I waited for Earl to smile. He did not. "So he put it back?" "That's what he said." I asked whether Earl had ever heard anything himself. He looked toward the front windows. "Once." "What did it say?" "Nothing I needed twice." That was all he would tell me. I went home before dawn. I did not sleep. At 9:30, I found Noah's number in an old email. I stared at it for a long time before calling. He answered with a cautious hello. I nearly hung up. Instead, I said the sentence I should have said 6 years earlier. "I lied to you about Dad's money." There was silence. I told him I had used part of the account before speaking to him, that I had been afraid the debts would swallow everything, and that I had turned fear into permission. Then I told him I had remembered our last conversation wrong. Noah did not forgive me on the phone.
I am glad you did not.
He asked for copies of the records. I sent them. He asked questions. I answered them. A month later, we met at a diner in Lebanon. The first hour was awkward. The second was worse. But we stayed. I kept working at Cedar Run for another 9 months, though I never again listened to the speaker on purpose.
When it clicked, I walked outside or went into the stockroom. Sometimes I heard a few words before I could get away. Never my name. Never Noah's. Earl replaced the call panel that winter. Pump 7 remained disconnected. The voices continued. I left the job the following spring when a printing company in Springfield hired me to run finishing equipment. The hours were better. The pay was better. Noah and I were speaking by then, carefully and not often, but honestly. Cedar Run closed in 2021. A chain bought the property, tore down the old building, replaced the tanks, and poured a larger concrete lot. Pump 7 disappeared, with everything else. I drove past the site the next summer. The new station was bright, clean, and open 24 hours. There were digital screens on the pumps and music playing under the canopy. I almost stopped. Then I saw a maintenance worker kneeling beside the easternmost pump. He had the lower panel open. A length of old gray wire was lying across the concrete beside him. It ended in a clean cut. I kept driving. Noah called me that evening. We talked for 20 minutes about his daughter starting college. Before we hung up, he said, "You sound tired." I told him I was fine. Then he laughed once and said, "At least that one sounded honest." I laughed too. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. In the silence, through my phone, I heard a small, mechanical click. There were 3 underground tanks at Pine Cut Fuel. I know that because I delivered to all 3 of them for almost 4 years. Regular, premium, diesel. The first time the monitor printed a 4th tank, I assumed someone had entered the wrong number during a service call. The second time, I thought the monitor itself was failing. By the time it told me the 4th tank was almost empty, I had already learned there was nowhere under that station for a 4th tank to be. In the fall of 2011, I was 54 and driving an overnight fuel route through northern Maine for a small distributor out of Bangor. Pine Cut sat along a 2-lane highway north of a place called Keeney Crossing, where the houses thinned out and the spruce came close to the road. Cell service came and went. After midnight, the station was usually 1 clerk, 1 row of fluorescent lights, and whatever came down the highway. The owner was Leon Barlow, a quiet man in his early 60s who preferred fixing old equipment to replacing it. His night clerk, Marcy Dole, brought crossword books to work and kept a wool sweater behind the counter, even in August. I knew them well enough to talk about weather, bad roads, and diesel prices. That suited me. I had been driving tankers for 27 years. I liked routes because they gave the day a shape, a load number, a sequence of stops, a signature when the work was done. Numbers were easier for me than people. That was especially true after a man named Raymond Pike left the company. Ray had trained me when I was 26. He was 15 years older, patient, and almost impossible to hurry. He taught me to listen to a pump instead of only watching the gauge, and never to trust a fill cap just because it looked tight. For 8 years we worked the same routes. Then fuel started disappearing from Ray's truck. 20 gallons, 32, 47. The losses usually followed remote deliveries. The company suspected he was selling fuel off the books. Ray denied it. I believed him until the night I rode with him to Pine Cut. That had been in 1993, long before Leon owned the station. I remembered Ray making a delivery after 2 in the morning. I remembered him taking a hose behind the building. I remembered asking what he was doing. He told me he was correcting an old inventory problem. I did not see where he connected the hose. A week later, management questioned me. I told them what I had seen. Ray was fired before Christmas. He never called me after that.
I told myself for years that I had simply answered a question. By 2011, I had gotten good at believing that. The first wrong reading at Pine Cut happened in October. It was a cold rain, the kind that made the highway shine black under the headlights. I pulled in a little before 2 in the morning, with regular and diesel in separate compartments. Marcy was inside doing a crossword. I grounded the truck, checked the fill caps, matched the product tags, and started the regular drop. Pine Cut had an old tank monitor mounted on the wall in the utility room. It was a gray metal box with a narrow green display and a small printer underneath. Leon used it because he did not trust the automatic reports that went to the office. When a delivery finished, Marcy usually printed a tank reading for me. That night, she brought the slip outside while I was putting the hose away. "Is this yours?" she asked. I thought she meant the gallons. Then she pointed to the bottom line. The first 3 lines were normal. Tank 1, regular. Tank 2, premium. Tank 3, diesel. Below them was another line. Reserve 4, 38.6 gallons. I read it twice. "What is Reserve 4? Marcy shrugged. "Ask Leon." "Do you have a 4th tank?" "Not unless he buried one last night." I laughed. She did too. The printer had been acting up, she said. A week earlier, it had printed the date as 1989. Leon had reset it. I folded the slip and put it with my delivery papers. The next morning, our dispatcher found no problem with the invoice. The truck volume balanced. Pine Cut's regular tank showed exactly what I had delivered. There was no missing fuel. I forgot about Reserve 4. 2 weeks later, it appeared again. This time I was delivering diesel. The monitor printed 12.1 gallons in Reserve 4. 3 nights after that, Leon called our office and complained that his tank monitor had started showing an extra product. Our service department told him the monitor belonged to the station, not us. Leon told them he already knew that. Then he asked if any of our drivers had seen the same thing. My dispatcher called me. I said yes. "What did you put in it?" "Nothing." "You sure?" "There is no 4th fill." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good answer." A missing gallon becomes a question very quickly. The next time I stopped at Pine Cut, Leon was waiting for me. It was after midnight. The rain had stopped, but fog sat low over the highway and gathered under the canopy lights. Leon led me into the utility room. The tank monitor showed the usual 3 tanks. No Reserve 4. He pressed through the menus. Inventory, delivery history, alarm history. There it was. Reserve 4, low level. The alarm had occurred at 2:16 that morning. "How can it alarm if it isn't there?" I asked. "That's what I'd like to know." He had already called the company that serviced the monitor. A technician was coming from Presque Isle the following week. Leon printed the history. Reserve 4 had appeared 6 times in the previous month. The level was different each time. 38 gallons, 12, 51, 9, 26, 4. Then nothing. The entries never lasted longer than 20 minutes. They always disappeared before dawn. I looked at the times. Most were between 1:30 and 3, all on nights when a tanker delivery had been made. Not always mine. That bothered me more than I expected. I asked Leon how long the monitor had been installed. "Since '99. "Did it ever do this before?" He took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt. "Not for a long time." That was not the answer I had expected. "How long?" He put the glasses back on. "Before I owned the place." I asked who had told him. Leon nodded toward a filing cabinet. "The old owner left manuals." That was all he said. A week later, the service technician came. His name was Will Garrison. I happened to be there because my route had been moved forward after a truck broke down. Will was maybe 35 and carried a laptop and a meter. He checked the probe wiring. 3 probes, 3 tanks. A 4th channel existed on the circuit board, but nothing was attached to it. No wire, no probe, no sensor. Will looked at the printed history. "That channel cannot know a level," he said. Leon asked if the board could generate random data. Will said yes, in theory. Then he looked at the numbers again. But random data usually looks random. He cleared the memory, replaced the backup battery, and printed a new configuration sheet. 3 tanks. Nothing else. For 11 days, Reserve 4 did not appear. Then, near the end of October, I pulled into Pine Cut at 1:40 in the morning and found the utility room printer running by itself. Marcy was standing in the doorway. Neither of us spoke until the paper stopped. Reserve 4, 2.3 gallons, low level. The monitor screen still showed only 3 tanks. Marcy tore off the paper. "Leon is going to hate this." I looked at the floor. There was a dark trail of wet boot prints leading from the back door to the utility room. They stopped 6 feet from where we were standing. The prints were large and muddy, with the square heel pattern common on work boots. Marcy noticed me looking. "Those yours?" I checked my boots. Dry rubber soles. Her shoes were small. We followed the prints to the back door. Outside, the ground was wet from evening rain. The prints crossed the gravel toward a concrete pad behind the building. Pine Cut had once had a small service garage there. By then, only the slab remained, cracked along the edges and partly covered with moss. Near the center was a round steel plate about 10 inches across. I had seen it before. I had never paid attention to it. The boot prints ended beside the plate. I crouched and wiped rainwater from the metal. No product tag, no lock, just a rusted ring and 2 stamped words. Reserve fill. I did not tell Marcy that I had seen something like it before. Not the plate itself. The place. The angle behind the building. The hose disappearing beyond the corner in 1993. For the first time in 18 years, I remembered Ray turning toward me and saying, "Stay with the truck." That part had never appeared in the statement I gave the company. I had forgotten it, or decided it did not matter. Leon came in before sunrise. He stared at the plate for a long time, then tried a pry bar. The plate did not lift. It had been welded to a steel collar set in the concrete. A rusted, threaded ring remained in the center, but the opening beneath it was packed with hard gray sealant. Will came back 2 days later with a utility locator. The signal showed no pipe leaving the collar. Leon hired a contractor with ground radar. They scanned the slab and the ground around it. No tank. No buried line. No void large enough to hold one. The contractor said the old fill had probably been abandoned properly when the service garage was removed. Leon asked if there had ever been a 4th underground tank. The contractor checked the state records. There had. A 500-gallon heating oil tank had been installed in 1978 to supply the garage furnace and an emergency generator. It was removed in 1997. The fill line had been cut, filled, and sealed. That should have ended the question. Instead, it made mine worse. Ray had been fired in 1993, 4 years before the tank was removed. I called the dispatcher at my company and asked whether old personnel files went back that far. He laughed. "Why? Something I need to check." "About what?" an old shortage. The company had changed owners twice, but a warehouse outside Augusta still held archived delivery records. I drove there on a Saturday and found Ray's file. 6 shortage reports, 3 written warnings, a termination notice. My statement was clipped behind the last report. I read it standing beside a metal shelf. Driver observed Raymond Pike handling delivery hose at rear of Pine Cut service after manifest delivery was complete. That was what I had said. It was accurate. It was also incomplete. Behind my statement were copies of Ray's delivery tickets. I expected to see altered totals. Instead, I saw a handwritten notation on the bottom of 4 tickets. Reserve, 26 gallons. Reserve, 41 gallons. Reserve, 18 gallons. Reserve, 33 gallons. Beside the last one, Ray had written a sentence. Level does not match physical tank. Check before 0. I sat down on an overturned crate. There was another sheet beneath it. A mechanic had inspected the station in November of 1993. He wrote that the 500-gallon reserve tank was sound, the fill pipe was intact, and the gauge showed 170 gallons. Then, in pen, someone from management had added, "Driver claim, unsupported by customer inventory." I read that line several times. The company had assumed Ray was putting fuel somewhere else because Pine Cut's owner said he had not ordered fuel for the reserve tank. Maybe Ray had been stealing. Maybe he had been keeping 2 sets of records. Maybe every memory I had of him had softened with age. I wanted a simple answer. The file did not give me one. It did give me an address. Ray was living in Vermont. I found a phone number online. For 3 days, I did nothing with it. Then Reserve 4 reached 0. It happened on a Monday night in early November. Wind had stripped most of the leaves from the birches. The temperature was just above freezing. I arrived at Pine Cut at 2:10 with a partial load of regular fuel. Marcy had already printed the tank levels. 3 tanks, everything normal. I connected the hose and started the delivery. Halfway through, the utility room alarm sounded. Not loud, just a repeating electronic chirp. Marcy came outside holding the paper. Reserve 4, 0.0 gallons. Critical low. I stopped the delivery. The moment the pump shut off, the canopy lights dimmed. Not off, dimmed. The white light over the lot turned yellow for maybe 3 seconds, then normal again. From behind the building came a sound I had not heard there before. A metal pipe settling after fluid passes through it. One hollow knock, then another. I walked around the building. The concrete pad was dry. So was the sealed fill plate. I put my hand on it. Cold. Marcy stood near the back door. "What are you doing?" "I don't know yet." I went back to the truck and checked the compartment gauge. The volume was correct. I checked the delivery meter. Correct. Nothing had gone missing. The monitor alarm stopped. Then the printer started again. Reserve 4, 0.0. The paper advanced 1 line at a time. Below the level, a new message appeared. Delivery required. Marcy read it over my shoulder. That wasn't there before. No. Can it even say that? I did not know. Leon kept old adapters and caps in a cabinet inside the garage. I found a 2-inch fitting that matched the ring inside the sealed plate, though there was no reason it should. I carried it outside. Marcy followed me. "You cannot put fuel into concrete." "I know." "Then what are you thinking?" That was a fair question. I was thinking about Ray.
I was thinking about 18 years of telling myself that what happened to him had nothing to do with me. I was thinking about the sentence in his file, check before 0. Mostly, I was thinking about the sound beneath the slab. I called Leon. He answered, half asleep. I told him what the monitor showed. He was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Do not put product anywhere except the tagged fills." I know the rule. I mean it. I know. If that old plate is involved, leave it alone. I asked why. Leon took a breath. Because the previous owner told me the same thing. What thing? To leave it alone. That is not the same as telling me why. No. Did he know Ray Pike? Another silence. Then Leon said, "I knew you were going to ask that eventually." He told me the previous owner had known Ray. He told me the previous owner believed Ray had been putting small amounts into the reserve tank without billing the station. Ray had always denied selling fuel or hiding shortages. The owner complained because he thought Ray was covering something up. Then, after Ray was fired, the reserve tank started losing level even when the furnace was off. The owner stopped using it. 4 years later, he had it removed. I asked Leon what happened when the level reached 0. I don't know. You do know something. I know he would not talk about that night. What night? The last one before he shut the tank down. I looked at the monitor paper in my hand. 0.0. Did anyone get hurt? No. Did anything happen? Leon was quiet. Finally, he said, "He closed the station for 3 days." The wind moved through the trees behind the lot. I could hear the loose metal edge of the old service sign tapping against its post. I told Leon I would finish the scheduled delivery and leave. That was what I intended to do. Then I saw the fuel hose on the concrete and remembered Ray taking his hose behind the building. Stay with the truck. For the first time, I wondered if he had been keeping me where he thought I would be safe. It changed the memory, even if it proved nothing. I finished the scheduled regular delivery, closed the valve, disconnected the hose, and capped the tagged fill. I wrote the final meter total on my ticket. Then I carried the hose back to the truck. The monitor inside chirped. Marcy came to the back door, holding a fresh printout. Reserve 4, 0.0. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then we heard footsteps on the gravel beside the tanker. Slow steps moved from the rear axle toward the passenger door. I could see that side of the truck in the convex mirror. No one was there. The passenger handle lifted once and settled back. Marcy whispered, "Did you see that?" I nodded. I did not touch the old reserve plate. I called dispatch instead. I gave dispatch the final meter number and told them about the untagged fill. The dispatcher told me not to put product anywhere except a verified fill and to shut the delivery down. That was the rule, and I followed it. I closed the valves, checked the seals, and put the hose in its tray. Marcy locked the back door. Then the tank monitor printed by itself. Marcy tore off the slip and stared at it before handing it to me. Reserve 4, 49.4 gallons. I checked the truck. The hose was still in its tray, the compartment seal was intact, and the valve was closed. The delivery meter was 50 gallons higher than the number on my ticket. There was no spill, and no sign the hose had moved. Inside, the critical alarm had cleared. By morning, Reserve 4 had disappeared from the monitor. My load record was still 50 gallons short. I reported the discrepancy before anyone else found it. The company took me off the route for a week while they checked the truck and the cameras. The recording showed me putting the hose away. It never showed it going behind the building. The 50 gallons were never found. I left the meter number exactly as it was, and let the record show what I knew and what I did not. Then I called Ray. He answered on the third ring. His voice was older than the one I remembered. I told him my name. He did not speak for a few seconds. Then he said, "I wondered if it was you." I asked what he meant. "Leon called me." That surprised me. I had not known they were in contact. Ray asked if Reserve 4 had come back. I said yes. "Did it reach 0? "Yes." Another pause. "How much did it take?" 50 gallons. He exhaled slowly. "That should hold." I didn't put anything in it. The line stayed quiet long enough that I checked the phone. Then Ray said, "Neither did I the first time." I asked him what it was. "I never found out." "What happens when it is empty?" "I never stayed long enough to find out." "You were fired over it?" "I know." "And you never told anyone?" "I told everyone who asked." I remembered the reports. Unsupported claim, inventory mismatch, unauthorized delivery. I said, "I told them about the hose behind the building." "I know." "What were you doing back there?" "Looking for where the missing fuel went. I never connected that hose to the old fill." I closed my eyes. "I thought you were stealing." "I know that too." The lack of anger made it worse. I apologized, not for answering the company's questions, for the years after, for never calling, for deciding that because I had not meant to hurt him, I had no responsibility for what followed. Ray listened. When I finished, he said, "You were young." I told him that was not enough. "No," he said, "but it is true." We talked for almost an hour. He had left fuel hauling, worked maintenance at a college, and retired the year before. He had a wife named Sharon, 2 grandchildren, a bad knee, and an old thermos he still used because the lid never leaked. I was grateful for every ordinary detail. Before we hung up, I asked one more time what happened at Pine Cut when the reserve tank went dry. Ray was quiet. Then he said, "The first time, I heard someone walking around the truck while I was unloading." "That's all?" "No." "What else?" "The footsteps stopped at the passenger door." I waited. "I had a trainee with me," he said. "He was supposed to be sitting there." The back of my neck tightened. "Was it me?" "No, before you." "What happened to him?" "Nothing." Ray's voice had changed slightly. "He was asleep in the seat. I could see him through the glass." "Then who was outside?" "I don't know." He said the footsteps circled the cab for several minutes. No one appeared. The mirrors showed an empty lot. Then the passenger door handle moved. Not opened, just moved. Ray put 20 gallons into the reserve tank. The footsteps stopped. He never let it reach 0 again. I asked why he had not told me when I rode with him. "You would have believed that?" I thought about who I had been at 26. "No." "That's why." Pine Cut replaced the old monitor the following spring. The new system never showed Reserve 4. Leon had the concrete slab removed when he rebuilt the back drainage. The contractor found the old steel sleeve beneath the plate. It went down 4 feet and ended. No pipe, no tank, no opening. just a steel tube filled with clean gravel and a plug of hardened sealant near the top. I kept driving for another 6 years. I never lost fuel at Pine Cut again. Ray and I spoke every few months. We did not become what we had been. Too much time had passed for that. But we became something else. That was enough. I retired in 2017. A regional chain bought Pine Cut a few years later. The old building came down. The pumps were replaced. The new store was larger and brighter, with a deli counter and digital signs over the aisles. I stopped there last October on my way north. It was raining. A young clerk was working alone. I bought coffee and walked around the side of the building while I drank it. The old service slab was gone. Fresh pavement covered the whole back lot. 3 new fill caps sat in a neat row near the tanker lane. Regular, premium, diesel. I stood there for a moment, listening to rain tap against the metal canopy. Then I noticed another round plate closer to the trees. It was smaller than the others. No color, no product tag, no lock. I walked over. 2 words were stamped into the steel. Reserve fill. I did not touch it. I did not need to. The rain was cold everywhere else. That plate was dry. Every November, when the first real snow comes down, I write the same man's name beneath the counter at North Branch Fuel. I use a black grease pencil because regular ink wipes off the laminate. The name is Martin Vale. No customer account under that name has ever existed in the store computer. The sheriff's department says they have no record of speaking to him. The state says the plate number I wrote down was never issued to the truck I saw. I still write the name. There are some things I no longer trust to a machine. I started working nights at North Branch in the winter of 2016, a few months after the paper mill in Larkspur, Wisconsin shut down. The mill had been the kind of place people used as a landmark. You could smell it before you saw the stacks. For 22 years, I worked in payroll and scheduling there. I knew which crews were short before the supervisors did. I knew who always forgot to turn in mileage sheets and who needed a paper check because their bank account had been frozen again. Then the owners announced the closure on a Thursday morning. By spring, the parking lot was empty. I was 51 and found out that knowing every shift code in a dead mill did not qualify me for much. North Branch sat 19 miles north of town on a state highway that ran between low timber country and frozen marsh. There were 6 pumps, 2 diesel lanes, a small repair bay that had not been used in years, and a convenience store with 1 wall of coolers and another wall covered in faded photographs of deer hunters. At night, most of our business came from plow drivers, log trucks, utility crews, and people who had ignored the last gas sign in town. The owner, Dennis Kroll, hired me because I could count a drawer without a calculator. I worked 11 at night until 7 in the morning. After the mill closed, people kept asking what I planned to do next. At North Branch, nobody asked. They wanted coffee, diesel, directions, or a bathroom key. I liked being useful again. The winter started early that year. By the middle of November, snowbanks were already forming along the edge of the lot. The highway department kept the main road open, but after midnight, you could go 40 minutes without seeing headlights. The first time Martin came in was on a Tuesday, around 1:30 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just finished wiping the hot chocolate machine and was writing the freezer temperatures on the nightly sheet. A dark blue pickup stopped beside Pump 4. It had a yellow beacon mounted on the roof, the kind used by road crews, but the beacon was off. There was no company name on the doors. The truck was old enough that road salt had eaten through the metal above the rear wheels. The driver came inside wearing insulated bib overalls and a canvas coat. He looked to be in his late 50s, gray beard, knit cap, tired eyes. He carried a stainless steel thermos with a dent near the bottom. "Coffee still 50 cents if I use my own cup?" he asked. "It is tonight." He smiled at that. While he filled the thermos, he looked around the store with the calm attention of someone checking whether things were where he remembered them. He paid with 2 quarters. Before leaving, he tapped one finger on the counter. "You still keep a paper customer book?" I told him we had never had one, at least not since I started. He looked toward the register. "You should." "For 50-cent coffee?" "For names." He said it without smiling. Then he walked out, got into the blue truck, and drove north. Nothing about the visit seemed important until the next afternoon. I came in early because Dennis wanted me to show a new part-time clerk how we closed the lottery drawer. Her name was Abby. She was 19 and had worked the previous evening. I mentioned the man with the dented thermos because I thought he might be a regular. Abby shook her head. "Never seen him." "He said he'd been here before." "Maybe with Janice." Janice worked mornings. She was behind us stocking cigarettes and heard the conversation. "Blue truck?" she asked. "Old Ford, yellow light on top?" Janice thought for a moment. "No." I let it go. Martin came back 2 nights later. Same truck, same thermos. He bought coffee and a package of peanut butter crackers. This time I asked if he lived nearby. "Not anymore," he said. "Working up north?" "For now." He did not seem unfriendly, just careful. When I rang up the crackers, the register rejected his loyalty card. The screen showed "Customer not found." Martin watched it for a second. "That happens first," he said. "What does?" "The easy stuff." I tried the card again. Same message. I handed it back. He put it in his wallet. "Write my name down," he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He did not laugh with me. "Martin Vale," he said. "Vale like a valley, without the Y." I picked up a pen and wrote the name on the corner of my freezer sheet. "There." He nodded once. "Keep it inside." I asked what that meant. He looked through the glass doors toward the dark lot. "Just inside." Then he left. The next morning I found the freezer sheet in the office. The temperatures were there in my handwriting. So was the note about the ice machine. The corner where I had written Martin's name was blank. Not torn off, not smudged. Blank. I held the paper under the fluorescent light because I thought maybe the ink had failed. There was no impression from the pen. I told myself I had written his name on another page. That explanation lasted until Saturday night. Martin arrived a little after 2. Snow had been falling since dark, soft and steady. His shoulders were white when he came through the door. I was already holding a black marker. He noticed. "Better than a ballpoint," he said. I wrote Martin Vale on the back of a cardboard cigarette display and put it under the register. He watched me do it. "Thank you." "What exactly am I doing?" "Helping me stay ordinary." He said it in the same tone someone might use to ask for a receipt. I asked if he needed a doctor. "No." "Are you in trouble?" "Not the kind a deputy can fix." Martin did not look confused. That made it harder. I asked for his driver's license. He hesitated, then handed it over. The card looked real. Wisconsin license, his photograph, his height and eye color. but the line where his name should have been was pale. Not empty exactly. There were faint gray marks, like letters left too long in sunlight. I tilted the card. What happened to this? It was clear in October. Did it get wet? No. Then you need a new license. I tried. He took it back. The clerk asked me who I was applying for. I remember feeling irritated then, not frightened. I thought he was trying to pull me into some elaborate story because I had been polite to him twice. I told him I had work to do. He apologized. He drank his coffee by the front window and left 10 minutes later. Before he crossed the edge of the pump canopy, he turned back and lifted one hand toward the store. Then he stepped into the falling snow. Something strange happened to my memory almost immediately. I knew a man had just left. I could picture the blue truck. I could picture the thermos. But his face would not settle in my mind. I looked down at the cardboard beneath the register. Martin Vale. The moment I read it, I could see him again. Gray beard, knit cap, canvas coat. I looked through the window. He was climbing into the truck. I looked away. His face blurred again. I read the name. It came back. That was the first time I stopped trying to explain everything at once. The next night, Martin did not come in. Neither did he the night after that. On Tuesday, I asked Dennis to check the exterior camera from Saturday. I told him I thought a customer might have left without paying for fuel. Dennis pulled up the recording in the office. At 2:12, the blue pickup turned into the lot. At least, I saw it turn in. Dennis leaned closer to the monitor. What are you looking at? The truck. What truck? I pointed. On the screen, tire tracks appeared in fresh snow beside pump 4. The snow darkened where tires compressed it. But there was no truck. A moment later, the front door opened by itself. I appeared behind the counter, speaking to empty space. Dennis looked at me. Colleen, were you alone? I felt heat rise in my face. No. The video showed me taking coins from nobody. Then it showed me writing on the cardboard and holding out my hand as if someone had given me a card. Dennis stopped the recording. You need a couple nights off. I'm fine. You're talking to an empty store. There was a man standing there. Dennis looked at me the way people do when they are trying to be kind without agreeing. I took the cardboard from beneath the register. The name was still there. I showed him. Who's Martin Vale? He asked. For some reason, that question made me feel steadier. At least the marker works, I said. Dennis gave me 2 nights off anyway. When I returned Friday, the weather had turned colder. The temperature was below 0, and the snow on the lot made a dry, squeaking sound under shoes. At 1:48, the blue pickup appeared at pump 4. I saw the tire tracks before I saw the truck. Then the truck seemed to be there all at once, as if my eyes had needed a second to decide what they were looking at. Martin came inside. He looked worse. His beard was longer. His cheeks were hollow. He carried the thermos, but no gloves. I locked the front door behind him. He looked at the deadbolt. That won't help. It makes me feel better. He nodded. I showed him the cardboard. His name was still visible. For the first time, he smiled in a way that reached his eyes. You always did have good handwriting. I stared at him. What did you say? The smile disappeared. He set the thermos on the counter. Then he reached inside his coat and pulled out a small brown envelope. The paper was soft at the folds and stained along one edge. The return address belonged to the Larkspur paper mill. I knew the old logo immediately. Martin pushed the envelope toward me. My handwriting was on the front. Not a signature. A name and address written in black block letters. Martin Vale. I sat down on the stool behind the register. The envelope had been mailed in 1998. Inside was a pay stub and a short note. The note was mine. Payroll conversion dropped your record. Enclosed is replacement check. Sorry for the delay. I read it twice. Then I looked at him. You worked at the mill? Contract maintenance. 6 weeks. I don't remember you. I know. He did not say it bitterly. That was worse. I asked how he had found me. He said after the mill closed, someone at the old Union Hall mentioned I was working at a highway station north of town. Why were you looking for me? Because you wrote my name down once when a computer lost it. That was payroll. It mattered to me. He folded the note carefully. Then he told me what had been happening. It had started in October. A pharmacy said he had no profile. A bank teller could not find his account until he showed an old deposit slip. His insurance company insisted the policy number belonged to no customer. At first, he blamed computer errors. Then his landlord forgot he lived in the building. A neighbor who had borrowed his ladder for 6 years introduced himself in the hallway. His sister answered the phone and said he had the wrong number. Martin drove to her house. She opened the door, looked directly at him, and apologized because she thought he was a salesman. He did not try again. I asked why he kept driving at night. Because some places slow it down. What places? Places where somebody has a reason to look at you. He nodded toward the counter. Gas stations, diners, toll booths, any place where a stranger has to become a customer for a minute. He had been moving from place to place for weeks. He kept a road atlas in the truck, with names written beside small towns. People who had remembered him for a little while. Most of the names had faded. Mine had not. I wanted to tell him that was impossible. Instead, I asked why the cameras could not see him. They did at first. And now? He looked toward the dark windows. Now I think they forget faster than people do. A pair of headlights came up the highway. A county patrol SUV turned into the lot. Deputy Owen Keats came in brushing snow from his shoulders. I knew Owen from town. He had a habit of buying 2 bananas on night patrol, even though we charged too much for them. He looked at the locked door. Everything okay? I unlocked it. Actually, maybe you can help me. Martin stood beside the coffee station. Owen looked straight at him. Sir, you having vehicle trouble? Martin shook his head. No. I felt a strange relief. Owen could see him. For the next 5 minutes, the 3 of us stood near the counter talking. Martin gave Owen his license. Owen read the faded card, asked his full name, and repeated it back. Martin Vale. He called the number into dispatch. Dispatch asked him to repeat it. He did. Then a burst of static came over his shoulder radio. Owen stepped outside to get better reception. Martin stayed inside. Through the window, I watched Owen speak into the radio beside his SUV. Less than a minute later, he came back. He looked at me. You said somebody needed help? I pointed at Martin. Owen followed my hand. For a second, he looked confused. Then his face changed. Sir, you having vehicle trouble? He asked. Same words, same tone. Martin closed his eyes. I said, You just talked to him. Owen frowned. No, I didn't. You had his license in your hand. He checked his right hand. The license was there. He stared at it. The photograph remained. The name line was blank. Owen looked from the card to Martin. "What is this?" Martin took the license back. "Nothing you can fix." Owen did not like that answer. He asked Martin to remain inside while he checked his patrol camera. 10 minutes later, he returned with a different expression. His dash camera had recorded the blue pickup. The audio had recorded Owen saying, "Martin Vale." Owen remembered saying the words. He did not remember who he had said them to. That was enough for me. I stopped wondering whether Martin had invented the problem. The problem was real. We just did not know what it was. Owen called for another unit, but Martin asked him not to. "Each new person lasts less time," he said. Owen looked at me. "Does that make sense to you?" No. But I believed him. At 3:15, a wind gust pushed snow across the lot, hard enough to erase the tire tracks around Pump 4. Martin went to the window. "My box is in the truck." "What box?" I asked. "Original papers, letters, tax forms, things with my name." "Leave them there." He shook his head. "Truck's almost gone on the camera." I looked at the security monitor. He was right. The blue pickup was visible, but weakly. The image seemed washed out, as though the truck sat behind a layer of fog that did not exist anywhere else in the picture. Martin said he needed the box inside. Owen offered to get it. Martin refused. "You won't know what you're looking for by the time you reach the truck." Then he looked at me. "You might." I understood what he was asking. The truck sat less than 40 yards from the door. I had walked farther than that to empty trash, but the pump canopy ended halfway there. Martin had already told me what happened beyond it. I looked down at the cardboard under the register. Martin Vale. I took the grease pencil from the drawer and wrote the name across the inside of my left wrist. Owen told me that was a bad idea. He was probably right. I unlocked the door anyway. The cold outside was sharp enough to hurt my teeth. Martin walked beside me. Under the canopy, I knew who he was. Martin Vale, contract maintenance, old payroll envelope, dented thermos. We crossed the line where the white light ended. By the third step, I could not remember why I was outside. I stopped. Snow blew across my boots. There was a man beside me. I knew I had seen him before, but I could not place him. He pointed at my wrist. I looked down. Martin Vale. The name opened a door in my mind. Not all the way. Enough. "Your truck," I said. He nodded. We kept walking. Halfway there, I forgot his face while looking directly at him. That is difficult to explain. I could see his eyes, his beard, the snow on his cap. I could describe every part separately, but they would not join into a person I knew. I read my wrist again. Martin Vale. At the truck, the driver's door was unlocked. Behind the seat sat a gray plastic file box. I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. On the lid, Martin had written his name dozens of times, in different pens. Some were dark. Some had faded to pale marks. One was almost gone. We started back. Near Pump 6, I heard the store door open. Owen stood under the canopy waving us in. I could see him clearly. The man beside me had become a stranger again. For 1 second, I almost left him there. I took 2 steps toward the store alone. Then I saw the writing on my wrist. I stopped. Martin was standing in the snow, with the expression of someone who had seen this happen many times. He did not call my name. He did not ask for help. He just waited. I walked back, took his sleeve in my free hand, and brought him under the lights. By the time we reached the door, I remembered him again. Not perfectly. Enough. We carried the box inside. Owen left just before 4. He wrote Martin's name in his pocket notebook before he went. The next afternoon, I called him. He remembered the snowstorm. He remembered stopping at North Branch. He remembered checking his dash camera. He did not remember why. When I asked him to open the notebook, he found a blank line between 2 traffic stops. Martin stayed until dawn. We did not talk much after that. He opened the file box once and showed me what was inside. Birth certificate, tax returns, old Christmas cards, employment forms, a library card, a union dues receipt. The kind of papers people keep because they prove things no one usually questions. His name was fading from all of them. The oldest paper was my payroll note from 1998. The writing was still dark. At 6:40, the eastern sky turned gray behind the trees. Martin put the papers back in the box. He left the old payroll envelope on the counter. I want you to keep this one. Why? Because your writing lasts. I told him I did not understand any of it. He said he did not either. Then he picked up the thermos. I asked where he was going. South. Do you have someone there? He considered the question. I used to. I asked if he wanted me to call anybody. No. He looked around the store one last time. You did enough. I hated those words. They sounded final. I offered to let him stay until Dennis arrived. Martin shook his head. More people won't make me more real. At the door, he paused. Then he looked back at the counter. Write it where you work, he said, not where you sleep. Why? Because work is where people notice when you're missing. He went outside. I watched him cross the lot. Each time my memory softened, I looked at my wrist. Martin Vale. He put the file box in the truck. He climbed in. The blue pickup pulled onto the highway and headed south. I watched until the taillights disappeared in blowing snow. Then I looked down. The writing on my wrist had faded to a gray shadow. I wrote it again before it disappeared completely. Dennis arrived at 7:10. I told him about the night. He listened for maybe 3 minutes before interrupting. Who's Martin? I reached under the counter for the cardboard. The marker was still there. Martin Vale. Dennis read it. Then he looked at me. Did you write this? Yes. Why? I did not know how to answer without sounding foolish, so I said, because I was asked to. The old payroll envelope was in my coat pocket. When I got home, I opened it at the kitchen table. My return address was still there. So was the mill logo. The note inside was still in my handwriting. Payroll conversion dropped your record. Enclosed is replacement check. Sorry for the delay. The line on the front where I had written Martin's name was blank. I knew what had been there. For several months, I called hospitals and county offices. No one had a record of Martin Vale. The plate number I had copied from his truck belonged, according to the state, to a small utility trailer registered in 1987. Owen's dash camera file corrupted before he could make me a copy. North Branch's exterior camera showed tire tracks appearing and disappearing in the snow. No truck. No man. Only me, leaving the store with an empty hand, walking into the dark, and coming back carrying one end of a plastic file box that the camera could not see. I kept working nights for another 4 years. Dennis never asked about the name under the counter. Maybe he stopped seeing it. Maybe he saw it and decided not to ask. Every winter, the grease pencil faded a little from cleaning solution and spilled coffee. every winter, I wrote it again. When I finally left North Branch, I took the old payroll envelope with me. It is in my desk now. The address is gone. The mill logo is almost gone. My note inside is fading too. There is only one part I still trust. Each November, I drive back to North Branch after dark. I buy a coffee from whoever is working. Then, when they turn away, I reach beneath the counter with a black grease pencil. And I write, Martin Vale, again. The clock above the cigarette cabinet stopped at 1:43 every Thursday night. Not every night. That was important at first, because it gave me room to be reasonable about it. Thursdays were when the fuel truck came. Thursdays were when the store computer ran its weekly inventory. Thursdays were also the nights I worked alone until 4 in the morning. For almost a month, I blamed one of those things. Then a truck driver showed me his dash camera. According to the video, 7 minutes passed while I stood behind the counter without moving. According to me, those 7 minutes had never happened. I was 58 when I took the night job at Halfway Fuel, a small station along Highway 20 in western Nebraska. The nearest town with a grocery store was 23 miles east. To the west, there was a grain elevator, a scattering of farmhouses, and a lot of open country that looked flat during the day and bottomless after dark. Halfway Fuel had been built in the late 1980s, when there was still enough traffic on that stretch to justify a repair bay and a little cafe. By the time I started there in the spring of 2019, the cafe had become storage. The repair bay held 2 broken ice machines, and most of our business came from ranchers, truckers, utility crews, and people who had misjudged the distance to the interstate. The owner was a woman named Dana Rusk. She was 42, practical, and usually tired. Her father had opened the station, and she had inherited it, with a stack of unpaid invoices and a roof that leaked over the lottery display whenever rain blew from the south. Dana knew I had worked for the railroad. She did not know why I had left. For 31 years, I had maintained signals and crossing equipment along a territory that ran through Nebraska and into Wyoming. I liked that work because most problems had a cause. A corroded relay, a broken bond wire, water in a junction box, a loose connection that only failed when the temperature dropped. You found the cause, you fixed it, and the system went back to being honest. My own record was less clean. Near the end of my career, I signed an inspection sheet for a crossing I had not fully inspected. Nothing happened because of it. No collision, no derailment. No one was hurt. That fact became the excuse I used whenever I thought about it. The actual reason I signed the sheet was smaller and harder to defend. I had been behind schedule. I was tired. A storm was moving in. I checked most of what I was supposed to check, skipped one cabinet at the far end of the approach circuit, and entered the inspection as complete. 7 minutes. That was about how long I saved. A supervisor found the discrepancy later because the cabinet seal number did not match the previous report. There was an investigation. I admitted what I had done before it became something worse. The railroad let me retire instead of firing me. My pension stayed intact. So did my shame. I spent the first year of retirement fixing things around my house that did not need fixing. Then I started driving at night, because sleeping had become difficult. When Dana offered me 3 overnight shifts a week at Halfway Fuel, I said yes before she finished describing the job. The work was simple. I cleaned the coffee machines, stocked coolers, checked the pump totals, mopped the floor, and kept an eye on the weather radio when storms moved across the plains. I liked the long, quiet stretches. At 1 in the morning, The refrigerators made more noise than the highway. At 2, the building seemed to settle into itself. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The soda cooler clicked off. Wind pressed against the front glass hard enough to make the aluminum frame complain. And then, on my 3rd Thursday, the clock stopped. It was an old round wall clock with a white face and black numbers. Dana said it had been there since her father opened the place. I was pouring out a pot of burned coffee when I looked up and saw the second hand stuck just past the 8. 1:43. I tapped the plastic cover with one finger. The second hand jumped forward. I checked my phone. 1:50. I assumed the battery was dying. The next afternoon, Dana replaced it. The following Thursday, at 1:43, the second hand stopped again. This time my phone also said 1:43. So did the register. I did not notice anything wrong until the radio host in Omaha repeated the same sentence. He was talking about overnight storms near North Platte. "The line should weaken before sunrise," he said. Then the refrigerator compressor clicked. Then the radio said, "The line should weaken before sunrise." Same tone, same breath. I turned toward it. The clock above the cigarettes still read 1:43. The radio repeated the sentence a third time. I reached for my phone. The screen showed 1:43. The seconds were not changing. That should have alarmed me more than it did. Instead, I stood there trying to decide which device was malfunctioning. I unplugged the radio. The store became very quiet. Outside, rain moved sideways across the parking lot. Water ran under the canopy in silver sheets. The red price sign beside the highway reflected on the pavement. A semi passed without slowing. I remember that clearly. Its headlights crossed the windows, its tires through water. I watched the red taillights fade west. Then the register beeped. My phone changed to 1:50. The wall clock began ticking. I plugged the radio back in. The announcer was halfway through a commercial. I wrote the time on a receipt and taped it beneath the counter. 1:43 to 1:50. 7 minutes. The next morning, Dana laughed when I told her. "Maybe Thursdays are longer out here," she said. I did not tell her that 7 minutes meant anything to me. I checked the electrical panel instead. The clock was on a battery. The register had a backup supply. My phone used the cell network. The radio was plugged directly into the wall. There was no single failure that should have stopped all of them together. Still, I wanted one. I spent part of Friday afternoon checking outlets with a meter I brought from home. Voltage was normal. The following Thursday was clear and cold for late April. At 1:35 I started watching the clock. Nothing happened. 1:40. 1:41. 1:42. At 1:43 the second hand reached the same place and stopped. My phone froze with the screen lit. The register display held on the last sale total. This time I was ready. I looked outside. The parking lot was empty. A moth circled one of the canopy lights. Wind moved the grass along the ditch. Nothing else seemed still. I counted slowly in my head. When I reached 60, I started again. At about 2 minutes, headlights appeared from the east. A pickup pulled in and stopped at pump 3. I watched a man get out. He wore a brown jacket and a baseball cap. He inserted his card, removed the nozzle, and began fueling. I expected the pump display inside to show the sale. It did not. The man finished, hung up the nozzle, and walked toward the store. He opened the front door. The bell above it did not ring. He looked at me. I said, "Evening." He did not answer. For a moment, we simply stood on opposite sides of the counter. He seemed confused, not frightened. He looked toward the coffee station, then back at me. "Bathroom?" he asked. I pointed down the short hall beside the coolers. He went that way. The hall light came on. A minute later, my phone changed to 150. The register made 3 quick beeps. The wall clock began moving. The bell above the front door rang. I turned. The man in the brown jacket was entering the store. Again. He nodded at me. "Evening," he said. I did not answer right away. He looked toward the coffee station. "Bathroom?" I pointed down the hall. He frowned. "You all right?" I asked if he had just been inside. He smiled the way people do when they are not sure if a stranger is joking. "No." I told him I thought I had seen someone who looked like him. "That would be bad luck for both of us," he said. Then he went to the bathroom. I checked the pump record. His sale began at 150. There was nothing at 143. When he came out, I asked where he had driven from. Scotts Bluff. Where was he headed? Valentine. He paid for a coffee and left. I watched his pickup until the taillights disappeared. Then I checked the hallway. It was empty. That was the first time I considered quitting. I did not. The reasons were not mysterious. I needed the routine. I liked the money. And somewhere beneath both of those things was the old part of me that hated leaving a problem unexplained. The next Thursday, I brought a notebook. At 1:38, I wrote down every sound in the store. Cooler fan, wind, ice machine, highway. At 1:43, the clock stopped. I drew a line under the time. The fluorescent lights did not flicker. The building did not shake. There was no sudden cold. The only change was a kind of flatness in the room. I could hear myself breathing. Outside, the highway looked normal. I walked to the front door. The automatic lock released when I turned the thumb latch, but the bell did not ring when I opened it. Cool air came in. I stepped onto the concrete apron. The canopy lights buzzed above me. A car passed in the distance. I could hear its engine. I looked back through the window. From outside, the store looked empty. I could see the counter. I could see the coffee machines. I could see the stool where I had left my jacket. I could not see my reflection in the glass. I moved closer. Still nothing. I raised one hand. The window showed the shelves behind me through my body, as if I were not standing there. I went back inside. The doorbell rang the instant my phone changed to 150. I wrote everything down. Then I tore the page out and folded it into my wallet. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. The first Thursday in May passed normally. So did the second. I began to wonder if I had turned a few electrical glitches and one confused customer into something larger because I was tired. Then a driver named Calvin Reed came in. Calvin hauled farm equipment and stopped at Halfway Fuel 2 or 3 times a month. He was in his early 60s, with a gray beard and the patient manner of someone who spent most of his life waiting for other people to load things. He came through the door at 2:10 on a Thursday morning and set his thermos on the counter. "You shut down earlier?" he asked. I said no. He looked toward the windows. "Could have sworn you did." I asked what he meant. He had parked across the highway around 140 because a strap on his trailer was loose. While he was tightening it, he noticed the station lights go dim. Not off, dim. He said he could still see the pumps and the sign, but the inside of the store looked dark. "I figured you were in the back," he said.
Then he added, "You stood there a long time, though."
I asked where. He pointed through the glass toward the old repair bay.
"By the side wall."
The repair bay had a steel personnel door on its east side. We kept it locked because the room was full of junk. I told Calvin I had not gone outside. He studied me.
"You want to see it?"
His truck had a dash camera. He brought the memory card inside and used my old laptop behind the counter. The video showed his truck pulling onto the shoulder at 1:39. Rain was not falling that night. The picture was clear. At 1:43, the digital timestamp continued normally. 1:44. 1:45. The station looked exactly as Calvin had described it. The canopy lights were on, but weak. The windows were dark. At 1:46, a man walked from the east side of the building. He wore my gray work shirt. He moved slowly toward the old repair bay. Calvin paused the video. "That's you, isn't it?" I leaned closer. The image was grainy, but it was me. Same height, same shoulders, same way of carrying my right arm, a little stiff from an old elbow injury. The man stopped at the steel door. He did not try the handle. He simply stood there facing it for almost 4 minutes. At 1:50, the lights brightened. The man was gone. Not walking away. Gone between one frame and the next. Calvin looked at me. I asked him to play it again. He did. I watched myself stand outside a door I had never approached. Then I noticed something on the wall beside it. A small rectangular plate. Metal. About the size of a railroad signal inspection tag. I asked Dana about it the next afternoon. She knew the plate. Her father had mounted it there when he built the repair bay. "Came off the old section shack," she said. I asked, "What section shack?" She looked surprised. "The railroad one. Used to be right here." I thought she meant near the property. She meant exactly where the station stood. Before Halfway Fuel was built, the land had belonged to the railroad. There had been a gravel service lane, a maintenance shed, and a small signal equipment building used by crews working the line north of the highway. Dana's father bought the parcel after the railroad moved the service point west. She led me into the repair bay. Behind a stack of cardboard boxes, bolted to the wall, was the metal plate from Calvin's video. I wiped dust from it with my sleeve. The stamped number was familiar, not because it belonged to me, because I had seen it in old maintenance records. Section 12. Signal Territory. 47. The crossing I had falsified the inspection for was in Territory 47. I had never worked out of that section shack. By the time I joined the railroad, it had already been abandoned. But the number was enough to make me sit down on an overturned bucket. Dana asked if I was sick. I said no. Then, for the first time since she hired me, I told her why I had left the railroad. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she looked at the plate. "You think this has something to do with that?" I said I did not know. That was true. What bothered me was something simpler. The false inspection had been signed at 1:43 in the afternoon. It had been a Thursday. I remembered because the investigation report listed the exact time. 1:43. I had saved 7 minutes. And every Thursday, when it happened, 7 minutes disappeared from me. Dana offered to move me to days. I almost accepted. Instead, I asked if I could see the original plans for the building. She kept them in a filing cabinet in the office. The plans showed the store, repair bay, fuel tanks, and drainage. Beneath the newer drawing was an older survey of the railroad property. The section shack had stood where the repair bay was now. Beside it was a narrow service pit. A handwritten note said it had been filled before construction. I read the note twice. Then I asked Dana if anyone had ever dug it up. Not that I know of.
The following Thursday, I arrived early. I brought a flashlight, my old railroad tool bag, and the copy of the investigation report I had kept for 9 years, without admitting why. At 1:30, Dana called. "You don't have to prove anything," she said. I told her I knew. That was another lie, but a smaller one. At 1:42, I stood behind the counter. The store was empty. I could hear a distant freight train somewhere north of the highway. At 1:43, the clock stopped. My phone froze. The room went flat. I waited. Nothing moved for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard a sound from the repair bay. Metal against concrete. One scrape, then another. I took the flashlight. The hallway light worked, but the bell over the front door was silent behind me. The repair bay smelled of dust, rubber, and old oil. The metal plate on the wall was clean. I had wiped it the week before, but now the entire surface looked newly polished. Below it, the concrete floor was damp. A narrow, dark line ran from the wall toward the center of the room. I crouched and touched it. Water. There had been no rain. The line ended at a square patch in the floor where the concrete was a slightly different color. The filled service pit. I heard the scrape again. Not beneath me. Behind me. The steel door. It opened inward about 2 inches. I had locked it before midnight. I knew that because I checked it every shift. I stood up. The gap widened. Cold air came through. Outside, instead of the parking lot, I saw gravel. Not our gravel shoulder. Railroad ballast. A yellow maintenance lamp stood on the ground 20 feet away. Beyond it was the dark outline of a small building. For a few seconds, I could not move. Then I heard a relay click. It was an ordinary sound from my old life, a metal contact changing position inside a cabinet. Click. Pause. Click. I stepped through the door. The air smelled like creosote and wet dirt. The station was behind me, but the parking lot was gone. There was only the old service lane. The small building ahead had a number painted beside the door. 47. I did not go toward it. That is important. Whatever else I did that night, I did not walk to that building. I reached into my tool bag and took out the folded investigation report. Then I placed it on the ballast. The pages moved slightly in the wind. I said, out loud, "I signed it." Nothing answered. I did not inspect the cabinet. The relay clicked again. I thought of all the ways I had described the incident over the years. A paperwork problem, a shortcut, a mistake, no harm done. All of those descriptions were true. None of them were honest. So I said the part I had avoided. I knew I was lying when I signed it. The yellow maintenance lamp went out. The darkness beyond it became complete. For a moment, I could not see the building. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. 1:50. I was standing inside the repair bay. The steel door was closed. My flashlight was on the floor. The investigation report was gone. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The parking lot was back. A sedan was pulling toward Pump 2. The driver waved through the windshield. I stayed at halfway fuel until morning. At 8, I drove to the railroad office in town.
I had not been there since retirement. The building had new carpet and a different receptionist. My old supervisor was gone. I asked to speak with someone in compliance. A younger man came out and listened while I explained that I had additional information about an old inspection case. He found the file. My admission was already in it. So was the disciplinary action. There was nothing new for them to do. I told him I understood.
Before I left, he asked why I had come in after all those years. I said because I had spent too long telling myself that being caught was the same thing as telling the truth. He nodded once. That was all. The next Thursday, I worked the same shift. At 1:43, I watched the clock. The second hand moved. 1:44 came normally. So did 1:45. I sat on the stool behind the counter until 1:50. Nothing happened. The week after that was the same. Dana removed the old metal plate from the repair bay and gave it to me. I keep it in my garage. Not as a warning, not exactly. More like evidence that certain things can stay unfinished long after everyone involved has closed the file. I worked at Halfway Fuel for another year. Then Dana sold the station to a regional company. They remodeled the store, removed the repair bay, and replaced the old wall clock with a digital display. I drove past once after the work was finished. The building looked brighter, smaller, too. There was no sign of the steel door, no sign of the plate. I did not stop. 3 months later, Calvin Reed called me. He had my number because Dana had given it to him after I left. He sounded embarrassed. He said he had been hauling east on Highway 20 on a Thursday night and stopped at Halfway Fuel for coffee. The new clerk was a college kid. Nice enough. Calvin bought his coffee and went back to the truck. Then, as he was pulling onto the highway, his dash camera froze. Only the camera. His truck clock kept moving. The camera timestamp held at 1:43 for 7 minutes. When it started again, the station was behind him. Calvin said he almost erased the file. Instead, he watched it once. Then he called me. I asked what was on it. For a while, he did not answer. Finally, he said, "You remember that old side door?" I said yes. "There's no door there now." I waited. Calvin took a breath. Something was standing where it used to be. I asked if it was me. No. That should have made me feel better. It did not. I still have the metal plate from the repair bay. Most nights it is just a piece of old steel on a shelf. But once a year, usually in late April, I wake sometime after 1 in the morning and go out to the garage. I do not know why. I stand there until the refrigerator compressor in the house shuts off and the room becomes quiet enough to hear the small clock above my workbench. I never look at it before I hear the click, and I never need to. It is always 1:43. The employee restroom at Alder Creek Fuel had a hallway behind it for 9 minutes at a time. The building had no hallway. I knew that before the county inspector showed me the plans, because I cleaned every room in that station 5 nights a week. The restroom backed against a concrete retaining wall. Beyond that wall was packed earth and a slope covered in juniper. Still, at 3:11 in the morning, the door sometimes opened onto warm yellow light and the sound of dishes being set on a table. I started cleaning Alder Creek in January of 2017. The station sat beside a 2-lane highway in eastern Montana, nearly 30 miles from the nearest town with a hospital. There were 4 pumps, 2 diesel lanes, a low convenience store, and a gravel pullout where livestock trucks parked when the weather closed the road. I was 44 then, and worked for a small janitorial company out of Miles City.
My route included a feed store, 2 medical offices, a credit union, and 3 gas stations. Alder Creek was my last stop because it stayed open all night, and because the manager did not mind if I arrived after 2. The night clerk was a man named Milo Hart. He was 26, quiet, and better at repairing coffee machines than talking to customers. He spent the slow hours doing online classes at a little folding table behind the counter. We got along because neither of us needed much conversation. He would move the floor signs for me, and I would leave the employee restroom until last. By 3:30, I was usually back in my van with the heater running. I had taken the cleaning job after my mother died. For 6 years, I had arranged most of my life around her appointments, groceries, and medications. When that ended, the empty hours felt less like freedom than a room someone had moved out of.
My daughter, Leah, lived in Spokane with her husband. We spoke every Sunday, but the calls had become careful in the way family calls sometimes do, when no one is angry and no one knows what to say next. She had a new job, new friends, and a small apartment I had only seen through photographs. I told people I preferred working nights. That was true. It was also true that nights gave me a reason not to notice how little anyone expected me to be anywhere. The first wrong detail at Alder Creek was a smell. I had just finished mopping the employee restroom when I noticed cinnamon in the air. Not the artificial cinnamon from the pastry case. This smelled like something baked in a home oven, with butter and brown sugar under it. I checked the vent. The fan was running. The wall behind the toilet was cold, and the supply cabinet was closed. Then I saw a line of light beneath the cabinet door. The cabinet was narrow and built into the wall beside the sink. It held paper towels, toilet tissue, soap refills, and a box of blue trash bags. I opened it every shift. That night, when I pulled the handle, the door moved about 6 inches and stopped. Warm air touched my face. Behind the door was not the supply cabinet. It was a hallway with pale wallpaper and a wooden floor. A lamp glowed somewhere around a corner. I could hear a radio playing softly, though I could not make out the song. I stood there with one hand on the cabinet handle and the other holding a spray bottle. My first thought was that I had opened the wrong door. That sounds foolish, but it was a small restroom at 3 a.m, and the mind reaches for ordinary mistakes before it accepts impossible ones. I closed the door, looked at the sink, and opened it again. The shelves were back. Paper towels, soap, blue trash bags. The wall behind them was exactly where it should have been. I checked my phone. It was 3:20. When I went out front, Milo was watching a video lecture with one earbud in. I asked whether there had ever been an apartment attached to the station. He paused the video. Not that I know of. Behind the restroom? There's a hill behind the restroom. I told him I had smelled baking and thought maybe air was coming through from somewhere else. Milo looked toward the back hall. The vent barely works. That was all. I did not tell him about the hallway. For the next 4 nights, the cabinet held cleaning supplies. The cinnamon smell did not return. I decided I had been tired enough to misread a reflection in the mirror and turn it into something larger. Then, the following Tuesday, I heard someone set down a fork. It was a small sound, metal touching ceramic. I was kneeling beside the toilet, replacing the paper roll, when it came from inside the wall. I held still. A chair moved across a floor. A woman coughed once. Then a man said, "She'll be here." The voice was calm and close. I stood and opened the restroom door.
The hall outside was empty. Milo was behind the counter, 30 feet away, looking at his laptop. The cabinet door clicked behind me. It had opened by itself. This time the hallway was wider. The wallpaper had tiny green leaves on it. At the far end, beyond the corner, I could see part of a kitchen table beneath a hanging light. There were 3 plates. One chair had been pulled back, as if someone had just stood up. I did not touch the door. I backed into the hall and called Milo. He came slowly, more confused than alarmed. By the time he reached the restroom, the cabinet was closed. I asked him to open it. He did. The shelves were there. Milo looked at me, then at the cleaning cart. "You all right?" I said I was tired. He offered to make coffee. The next night, I brought a tape measure. The restroom wall was 7 feet, 4 inches from the hallway corner to the outside wall. The cabinet was 14 inches deep. Outside, the concrete retaining wall began less than 2 feet behind the building. There was no hidden space. At 3:10, I stood in front of the cabinet with my phone recording. Nothing happened for almost a minute. Then the restroom light dimmed. The fan slowed. The cabinet handle turned downward. At 3:11, the door opened. The hallway was there. I kept the phone pointed at it. The screen showed the open cabinet and darkness beyond. Through my own eyes, I saw yellow wallpaper, wooden floorboards, and a framed picture hanging near the corner. The picture showed a lake in summer. On the recording, there was only black. I moved the phone aside and leaned closer. From the kitchen, a woman said, "Nina?" That was my name. I closed the door hard enough to shake the mirror. When I opened it again, the cleaning supplies had returned. The phone said 3:20. The video was 9 minutes long. For most of it, I was standing motionless in front of the cabinet. At 3:11, the restroom light dimmed. The cabinet door opened. I did not move for 8 minutes and 42 seconds. There was no hallway on the screen. There was no voice. At the end, I closed the door and stepped back. I watched the recording twice in my van. My face looked awake. My eyes stayed fixed on something the camera could not see. I nearly quit the route that morning. What stopped me was not courage. It was money. My mother's final medical bills had taken most of my savings, and the janitorial company did not have another route with the same hours. I told myself I could clean the restroom before 3:11. I told myself I could leave the cabinet closed. For almost 2 weeks, that worked. I arrived earlier. I finished the back hall by 3. At 3:11, I stayed near the front windows, where I could see the highway and the red glow of the price sign. The cabinet did not open when no one was near it. Then a truck driver named Cal Mercer stopped during a snowstorm. He was in his late 60s and drove a cattle hauler with an empty trailer. Ice had closed the highway west of us, and he was waiting to hear whether the plows had cleared the pass. Cal bought coffee and sat at one of the 2 small tables near the front. Milo knew him from other nights. They talked about road conditions while I cleaned around them. At 3:08, Cal asked for the restroom. Milo pointed toward the back. I looked at the clock above the cigarette cabinet. I told Cal the employee restroom was being cleaned and suggested he use the public one near the entrance. He said the public one was out of order. Milo had taped a sign to it after the toilet overflowed. I followed Cal down the hall. The employee restroom looked normal when he entered. I waited outside with my cart, listening to wind push snow against the metal siding. At 3:11, the light under the restroom door turned yellow. Not white like the fluorescent fixture,
yellow and warm. Cal did not come out. I knocked. No answer. I opened the restroom door. The room was empty. The cabinet stood open. Beyond it was a kitchen I had never seen before. The hallway was gone. The doorway now opened directly beside a round table covered with a red vinyl cloth. A woman with silver hair stood at a stove with her back to me. Cal sat at the table. His coat was hanging on the back of a chair. Snow was melting from his boots onto a braided rug. He looked younger, not in his face exactly, in the way he sat, with both hands around a mug, waiting for someone else to speak. I called his name. He did not turn. The woman at the stove said, "He just got home." Her voice was not threatening. That made it worse. I stepped through the cabinet doorway. The air smelled like coffee, fried onions, and wet wool. A clock above the stove read 3:11. Its second hand moved, but the minute hand did not. Cal looked at me then, his eyes filled with confusion. "Nina?" he said. I had never told him my name. The woman placed a plate on the table. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, peas. Cal stared at it. "My mother made it this way," he said. The woman turned slightly, but I never saw her face. The light from the stove hood left it in shadow. "She kept it warm," the woman said. I reached for Cal's sleeve. He pulled away. "Road's closed," he said. "I can stay till morning." Behind me, the cabinet doorway had narrowed. The restroom beyond it looked farther away than it should have been. I grabbed Cal's coat from the chair and threw it through the opening. The coat landed on the restroom floor. The woman stopped moving. The radio on the counter went silent. Cal looked toward the doorway. For a moment, his expression changed. He seemed to remember where he was. I took his wrist. This time, he came with me. We stepped through just as the cabinet door began to close. Milo was standing in the restroom doorway. He caught Cal by the shoulder and pulled him clear. The cabinet slammed shut. My phone said 3:20. Cal had been gone 9 minutes. He believed it had been less than 1. We sat him near the coffee machine. His hands shook so badly that Milo had to hold the cup while he drank. Cal said the woman in the kitchen had been his mother. She had died when he was 32. The kitchen belonged to the farmhouse where he grew up, except for one thing. The red tablecloth had been bought by his wife years later. His mother had never seen it. That detail ended the explanation I had been trying to build. Whatever the room was, it was not replaying a single memory. It was assembling a place from whatever made returning feel possible. Milo showed us the security recording. Cal entered the restroom at 3:10. I followed him a minute later. For 9 minutes, no one came out. The camera covered the hallway. There was no second exit. At 3:20, the restroom door opened, and the three of us stumbled into view. Milo had no memory of entering the restroom. On the recording, he walked down the hall at 3:19, stopped outside the door, and placed both hands against it, as if holding it open. He remembered standing behind the counter the entire time. Cal stayed until the road reopened. Before he left, he asked whether I had heard the woman call me by name. I said yes. He looked toward the back hall. Was she someone you knew? I told him I had not seen her face. That was true. It was not the whole truth. The voice had sounded like my daughter. Not exactly like Leah spoke on the phone. Younger, softer. The way she sounded at 16, when she came home late,
and still expected me to be awake.
The next morning, I called the station manager, Roy Bell. I told him there might be a structural problem behind the restroom cabinet. I did not mention the kitchen. Roy met me there with a county building inspector named Paula Wynn. They removed the cabinet shelves and checked the wall with a small camera through an access hole. Concrete block, insulation, retaining wall. No hallway. Paula brought the original building plans from the county office. The station had been built in 1979. The restroom had always been in the same place. There had never been an apartment. Roy listened to my description without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question. "What time?" I said 3:11. He sat down on the closed toilet lid. Before his family bought Alder Creek, the station had belonged to a man named Harold Dace. Harold worked nights and lived alone in a trailer behind the hill. In February of 1988, Harold disappeared during his shift. The station door was locked from the inside, the register balanced. His coat and truck were still there. The employee restroom had been wet from a freshly mopped floor. A supply cabinet door stood open. The sheriff assumed Harold had walked away and found another ride. There was no camera system then. No one ever reported seeing him again. Roy's father bought the station 2 years later. He replaced the restroom cabinet because the old one would not stay closed. I asked why Roy had never warned Milo. "Warned him about what?" Roy said. "A story my dad told once when he was drinking." Paula asked whether Harold had family. "A sister in North Dakota," Roy said. She had been dead for years. Harold had never married. There was one more detail. On the night he disappeared, a blizzard had closed the highway. Harold called his sister shortly after midnight. He told her he could smell his mother's cooking in the restroom. His mother had been dead for 14 years. Roy closed the cabinet and put a screw through the handle into the frame. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then the screw appeared on the restroom floor at 3:20. The cabinet was still closed. The hole in the frame was gone. Not patched. Gone. Roy wanted to remove the cabinet entirely. Paula advised against cutting into the wall until the retaining structure could be reviewed. In the meantime, they put a steel hasp across the door and added a padlock. At 3:11 the next morning, the hasp was warm enough to burn Milo's finger. By then, I had decided to leave the job. I finished the week because another cleaner needed time to take over my route. I stopped entering the employee restroom after 3. Milo used the public one and kept the back door locked. The final night was a Thursday in early March. The storm had passed, but the temperature dropped below 0. Frost gathered inside the lower corners of the windows. The highway was open, though traffic was light. At 2:50, Milo told me he had received a message from his sister. Their father had fallen in Billings and was being taken to the hospital. Milo wanted to leave. Roy was 40 minutes away. I told him to go. I could watch the register until Roy arrived. Milo hesitated, then took his coat and left. His taillights disappeared east through blowing snow. I locked the front door and continued cleaning. At 3:07, the restroom fan turned on by itself. I heard it from the sales floor. At 3:09, Cinnamon moved through the station. At 3:10, the price sign outside went dark. The cabinet door began knocking against the padlock. Not hard. 3 soft taps. A pause. Then 3 more. I stood behind the counter and called Roy. No signal. The landline gave only static. At 3:11, the padlock fell onto the restroom floor. The cabinet opened. From the front of the store,
I could see warm light filling the back hall. A woman called my name. "Nina, supper's ready." This time, the voice was clearly Leah's. I should have stayed near the door. I should have waited for Roy. Instead, I walked down the hall. The restroom had become larger. The mirror reflected a room behind me that was not there when I turned around. The cabinet doorway opened directly into a small apartment kitchen. I recognized it from photographs Leah had sent. White cabinets, a narrow window over the sink, 2 blue mugs hanging from hooks, a plant with long leaves on the sill. I had never been inside that apartment. Leah sat at the table. She looked the age she was then, 31. Her hair was tied back. She wore the gray sweater from a photograph taken at Christmas. There were 2 bowls of soup on the table. 1 chair was pulled out for me. "You finally made it," she said. The words hurt because they were not cruel. I stood in the doorway. The room included details I had never seen in photographs. A crack in the tile near the refrigerator, a stack of mail held down by a salt shaker, a small burn mark on the table. I did not know whether those details were real. Leah lifted one of the blue mugs. "It's cold out there." I asked what would happen if I sat down. She looked toward the empty chair. "You wouldn't have to go back alone." Behind me, the restroom light flickered. The doorway began to narrow. I thought of Harold Dace. I thought of Cal sitting at his mother's table while snow melted from his boots. I thought of how easy it would be to accept one warm room when the alternative was a van, an empty house, and another careful Sunday call. Then I noticed the clock above Leah's stove. 3:11. The second hand moved around the face without advancing the minute. I asked Leah what day it was. She smiled, but did not answer. I asked what she had done at work that morning. She looked down at the soup. The room knew how to welcome me. It did not know how her day had been. That was enough. I reached into the restroom, took the mop from my cart, and pushed the handle through the cabinet opening. I laid it across the doorway to keep it from closing. The kitchen light dimmed. Leah stood. For 1 second, her face changed, not into something monstrous, into nothing I recognized. The features were still human, but arranged without history behind them. "Nina," it said. I stepped backward. The mop handle bent. I pulled harder. The cabinet doorway narrowed around the wood until the handle cracked near the middle. I fell onto the restroom floor with half the mop in my hands. The cabinet door closed. The fluorescent light came back. My phone said 3:20. Roy arrived 4 minutes later. He found me sitting against the wall. The cabinet was open again, but it held only supplies. The broken half of the mop that had gone through the doorway was missing. I quit before sunrise. Roy closed the employee restroom for the rest of the winter. That summer, he hired a contractor to remove the cabinet and the entire section of wall behind it. They found concrete block, insulation, and packed earth. No hallway, no room, no broken mop. Alder Creek Fuel stayed open another 3 years. Roy eventually sold it to a regional chain. They remodeled the building and moved both restrooms to the opposite side of the store. I never worked another overnight cleaning route. The week after I quit, I called Leah on a Wednesday instead of waiting for Sunday. I told her I wanted to visit if the invitation was real and not just something we kept saying. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, it's real." I drove to Spokane in April. Her apartment looked almost exactly like the kitchen behind the cabinet. White cabinets, narrow window, blue mugs, long-leafed plant. There was no crack in the tile, no burn mark on the table. The salt shaker was different too. That helped. We spent 3 days together. Nothing dramatic changed. We went to a grocery store, folded laundry, watched a movie, and argued mildly about how much coffee I drank. Ordinary things. They were better than the room. I have visited every spring since then. Last year, Leah and her husband moved into a house outside Spokane. While unpacking, she found a small cardboard box she did not recognize. Inside was half of a wooden mop handle. The broken end was dark, as if it had been held near a stove. Around the wood, someone had tied a plastic restroom key tag from Alder Creek Fuel. Leah asked whether it belonged to me. I told her no. The tag had no room number or station name, only a time. 3:11.